Thank you, Steve. It's a very good name. I'm Steven Stromberg, MBA, BA, IDK, OMG. So I'm going to talk about California fleet zero-emission vehicle policies. These are the policies that affect basically what we can pick and not pick when we're making our fleet acquisition plans and we're going to decide what we're going to purchase. So there are some rules, so we'll get started. We're going to discuss our background, zero-emission vehicle mandate, ZEV points breakdown, and zero-emission vehicle, that's what ZEV stands for, by the way. ZEV Hybrid First purchasing mandate, ZEV Infrastructure Readiness, how acquisition plans are evaluated, that's how ZEVs are deployed, and available ZEVs, ZEV deployment, and then finally, your questions. I only have 15 minutes, so we're going to try to get through it all. Background. So the main background for all of the things we do is climate change, pollution, smog, which resulted in a necessity to address what the state could do. So then we had Executive Order B1612, where Governor Brown decided that we need to have zero-emission vehicles, and we're going to increase them in our fleet whether we like them or not. So through our normal course of fleet replacement, it was originally stated that we need to start with 10% of all of our light duty, which means under 8,500 GVWRs needed to be zero emission. And then later on, after that, we needed to pursue opportunities to provide electric vehicle charging stations and accommodate future charging infrastructure demand at employee parking facilities in new and existing buildings. So we had the horse before the cart, now we need to get the chargers in there in place. And then Public Resources Code establishes the goal of reducing or displacing the consumption of petroleum products by the state fleet when compared to the 2003 consumption levels based on the following schedule. By January 1st, 2012, we had to do a 10% reduction, and by 2020, we had to do 20% reduction. So we're really moving away from fossil fuels. We're moving away from gas. We're not going to do that anymore. And then in 2016, we were told to do a ZEV action plan where Governor Brown issued the second iteration of the plan, which basically provided an updated roadmap towards what he originally had in his governor's executive order here, and called for 1.5 million zero-emission vehicles on California's roadway by 2025. So that's only 8 years from now, and that's full zero emission. So moving on, this is our mandate. This is our ZEV mandate. So each year, we have to increase it a little bit more. We started with 10%, and by the end, it's got to be 50%. 50% of our light-duty vehicles, that's half, has to be zero emission. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to eventually have a truck that's zero emission because we're CalTrans. Most of our stuff is trucks. So that's what we're going to need to do. So in order to comply with the goals, we're going to try to get one of these workhorse W15 pickup trucks. We're looking into that, which seems to be a pretty good option for us if it turns out well. So what happens when you purchase beyond that 10% ratio or whatever the ratio is? Well, how it used to work up until a few months ago was you would get credits. And so one battery electric vehicle would get you one credit. And if you had an extra long-range plug-in hybrid electric vehicle like a Chevy Volt, you would also get a credit. But like a plug-in Prius, which doesn't go that far, you would only get a fifth of a credit. So what do you do with the credit? They can be used towards the applicable yearly mandatory ZEV acquisitions. So you can apply them to future years. They're sort of banked for you. While you can't get ZEV points anymore, you can still apply the ones that you had to your future plans. So CalTrans does have a few of those saved up. We also have a policy called ZEV Hybrid First. So how that works is before you decide you're going to go and select a Chevy Impala that runs on gasoline, you have to get a ZEV Hybrid First. You have to justify why it is you need that. In most cases, you're not going to be able to. So basically, this is a mandate that what you need to be buying is zero-emission vehicles and hybrids and plug-in hybrids. So this started in 17-18, our fiscal year now. State agencies are subject to the ZEV Hybrid First policy requiring state agencies to procure battery electric, hydrogen fuel cell, plug-in hybrid, and or other hybrid vehicles in lieu of fossil fuel consuming internal combustion engines or ICE engines and other specified vehicles when available. So here's the purchasing priority for that. What they want is the pure ZEVs first, so no fuel. Then the plug-in hybrid, where if it runs out of battery, it will use fuel. And then finally, the hybrid electric vehicles, which are still internal combustion engine vehicles, but go a lot farther. So how do we process the fleet acquisition plan? This is the plan where we have all of our vehicles that we've selected for the year that we want to add to our fleet. Well, we need to determine what needs to be replaced or reduced in the fleet and what should be, if anything, it should be replaced with. And then we have to fully justify these decisions. So if we find out that a vehicle isn't being utilized, why replace it? Why pay the money? We should just downsize it and get people to use one vehicle, where otherwise they were using two. We need to get our department and agency approval. And then after we finally do that, we submit the FAP to DGS, where I used to work. And this is our regulator who will apply all the mandates, statutes, regulations, and laws to our fleet acquisition plan to make sure it's compliant with those things. Then after DGS approves it, it can go to the government ops agency if there's cause for further review. Sometimes if it's CalTrans, it's a really big purchase, or it's stuff like an airplane that they're not used to. Just to be sure, they'll send it one step closer to the governor and to the government ops agency. And once they approve, the completed plan is given back to us, and then it can go onto our purchasing department, and we can finally get those vehicles and equipment. We also have the minimum fuel economy standards policy. The combined annual purchases by a state department of passenger vehicles and light-duty trucks under 8500 GVWR must meet the minimum state average fuel economy standard of 38 miles per gallon for passenger vehicles, kind of high, you're going to have to buy hybrids, and 22.2 miles per gallon for light-duty trucks, vans, and sport utility vehicles. So when this first came out, we couldn't meet it because there was nothing on our statewide contract for the trucks that were that fuel efficient. So really, it was planning for the future, and now we're starting to see trucks that can get 22 miles per gallon and better. We have those aluminum bed F-150s and other things. So these fuel economy standards only apply to passenger vehicles and light-duty trucks that are powered solely by an internal combustion engine. So if it's powered by electricity and other things, it doesn't matter. This doesn't apply. The fuel economy standards do not apply to plug-in hybrid electric vehicles or battery electric vehicles. Okay, so how does DGS, when they get our fleet acquisition plan, process it? What are the things they're looking at? They're going to make sure we met our zero emission vehicle purchasing requirements. They're going to make sure we meet the old EPAC requirements too, which now zero emission vehicles do count towards EPAC credits. We're going to make sure that we did our ZEV Hybrid First purchasing policy. Then they're going to make sure that we also did our minimum fuel economy requirements. And then they're going to make sure that we're not adding any additional vehicles to our fleet count, meaning we're not replacing anything, but we just decided we're going to go ahead and buy 10 more cars when before, they weren't there, they didn't exist. So all these things require sufficient reasoning if you're going to differ from that. Whether or not there is infrastructure in place is also something to look at when you're deploying ZEVs. They're not going to let you put a Toyota Mirai hydrogen fuel cell vehicle on top of a mountain because there's no fuel infrastructure there for it. So they're going to think, well, something's wrong here. So they're going to want to make sure that you're going to be putting these in a place where they're going to be used. And then anything that's really not a compact sedan has to be properly justified. Anything that's not a compact sedan. If it's a bigger sedan, they're going to ask, why can't it be smaller? So these are the things that we have to deal with in fleet and answer and come up with justifications for. Then the equipment not replaced in kind have to be fully justified. So when we don't justify them, they come back to us with a list saying, these are our qualms. We want answers for these. If not, your stuff's just going to sit on a desk. So we try to get that back to them as soon as possible. And then finally, DGS is going to run a report on vehicle utilization. We report all of our stats via GPS into their system that tracks fleet. It's called FAMS, Fleet Acquisition Management System. And so they have access to all those records. And what they do with that is they determine whether or not we're meeting 6,000 miles a year for our light-duty fleet or a certain amount of days in the month that they're being used. And if not, they're going to say, we want you to reduce without replacement. It's going to end up making our fleet smaller if we're not being used. So it's an encouragement to use the vehicles, but also an encouragement to downsize and not waste the state's money. So another thing we got to do is ZEV Infrastructure Readiness. So when we submit that FAT plan to DGS, OFAM, state agencies must be able to demonstrate sufficient ZEV infrastructure to support it. So the new thing is now we got to put up all the infrastructure for these ZEVs that we've bought, because we've previously had a mandate to buy, but we didn't have a mandate to really support them. So now we're going to have to do that. After a comprehensive survey earlier this year, state agencies are to begin comprehensive site assessments on those facilities I've identified to be in need of EV charging infrastructure improvements in order to support the agency's workplace charging and ZEV fleet procurements through fiscal year 2021. And the goal is to assist state agencies in the development and implementation of each agency's workplace charging plan that will result in EV charging availability at a minimum of 5% of all workplace charging spaces at state-owned facilities. So our governor, he's very green. He wants to make sure that we have charging available to both our ZEV fleet and as well as state employees. Whether or not we want to charge for that, he leaves it up to the department, but he wants to make sure that it's an option. So these are some of the available zero-emission vehicles you can get. I'm sure some of those you've heard of. So there's pros and cons for hydrogen and battery electric vehicles. Obviously, hydrogen here fills up just around the same time as gasoline, maybe just a little bit longer, but you can be back on the road in no time. But most people don't have the time to stick around 6 or hours on their trip to LA from Sacramento and charge it. So that's kind of a negative for the electric. The range starts for hydrogen at 265 miles, and then for electric at 60. So it really depends on the battery and the model you get. And now here's the negative for hydrogen, the cost per mile. Hydrogen is still sort of expensive. It's 33 cents per mile. Using just electricity, average prices, it's between 4 cents and 9 cents a mile for a typical electric vehicle. So that's something to consider. And making electricity is a little bit easier than making hydrogen right now. It's an extra step. So how do we deploy our zero-emission vehicles? So after we get approval to buy these, we have to figure out where we're going to put them exactly. So we determine vehicle usage using our GPS telematics. We take into account the internal program that uses the vehicle, for instance, administration versus construction. They're going to have different needs, and they're going to be in different places. We're going to take into account the topography and climate of a region it will deploy to. So once again, the good example is we're not going to put a zero-emission vehicle on top of a snowy mountain. It's just probably not a good idea. It's going to be something that needs to be four-wheel drive. It's going to need to have higher ground clearance. It's not going to work. So we need to look at those things. We need to determine the distance to a hydrogen fueling station or an EV charger, so that way they can get back and refuel. We need to determine the charging and fueling times based on the applications. We need to determine the cargo and payload requirements of specific jobs and compare them to the capabilities of that zero-emission vehicle. And then we need to determine the appropriate applications for all these vehicles. So some of the things we look at are where the stations are at. These are all the hydrogen stations. Some of them are already built, some are being built, but pretty much up and down the occupied areas of the state. Eventually, they're going to be everywhere. And then we also look at topography and geography, and we sort of determine, where's mountains, where is valley, those types of things when we do it. So we look at range accommodation, making sure that they can get to their jobs. Early adopters, people who are willing to take it, who are in communities that have infrastructure in place, and then non-permanent equipment such as the EV arc. So on this screen, I don't know if you can see it, it's a little light, but this is the EV arch, and it's a portable solar generator for a car. They just put it in a parking space, they drop it off, and this thing here tracks the sky and makes sure it's in the perfect position to get solar power, and it stores it in this little battery here and charges it. So you can be at a work site in the middle of nowhere and have your car powered. So there's new things coming out. So this is currently on our governor's desk. It's AB 739, and it's an amendment to the Public Resources Code for heavy-duty vehicle purchases. So we've talked about light duty. There's already stuff in place where you have to buy zero-emission light duty. Well, we're moving into heavy duty now. It's going to require state agencies to purchase zero-emission vehicles when replacing heavy-duty vehicles over 19,000 pounds gross vehicle weight ratio. And that's got to be 15% by 2025 and a total of 30% by 2030. And there's not a whole lot of stuff out there yet for it. So to meet this demand, we are definitely looking. CalTrans is currently looking at the fuel cell sweeper that's going to be delivered this fall. After this presentation in a couple hours, if you go to the equipment display that we're going to have, you're going to see a hydrogen-powered fuel cell sweeper, and it's totally neat. It'll be open so you can see the fuel cell stack, and it's what Steve Takagawa, our keynote speaker, was talking about when he said it was the first of its kind, the first in the world, because it really is an amazing vehicle. This is what it looks like, and this part opens up, and you got the fuel cell stack back here, and that's pretty much it.
Okay, thank you, Stephen.
The preceding video was produced by the National Center for Pavement Preservation. More information can be found at tsp2.org. That's tsp2.org. Additional support provided by Michigan State University.